Well, as Robert Southey, the great Romantic poet, writes, although he's perhaps less well known these days than his great friends Wordsworth and Coleridge, he points to the importance of the French Revolution in shaping the poetry of this period. Few persons, but those who have lived in it, can conceive or comprehend what the memory of the French Revolution was, nor what a visionary world seemed to open upon those who were just entering it. Old things seemed passing away, and nothing was dreamt of but the regeneration of the human race. Now, in 1824, he's looking back to 20 years earlier, 25 years earlier, to the hope and possibility of the French Revolution, that it was going to provide liberty, fraternity, and equality, or egalitarianism for all. And of course, it failed in all of those. But I think what Southey's also picking up really well here is poets were part of this radical movement in the same way that we see today important social movements emerging on social media with voices being elevated and raised through platforms such as Twitter and YouTube. Poets were part of that radical movement. They were sharing their ideas, disseminating their ideas. They were the real radicals of this era. And they were also the people who were in many ways trying to offer up what can come next after this massive shift in thinking, this huge overturning. In what ways can we regenerate the human race? I think, though, what we also see is with the wars that break out across Europe and with the climate crisis that occurs at this point, with, as I say, that summer that didn't happen in 1816, essentially winter temperatures extended all around the year, mainly the consequence of an ash cloud that caused there to be no summer. But this caused crop failures and things like that. So I think there is so much that we can see in this this end of century moment, this moment in which there is such hope for change, and how actually what happens immediately after is the disappointment of those hopes. But all across it, you've got poets grappling with these big crises and trying to come up with new ways of thinking about human relations, about politics, about a new form of democracy that can displace autocratic rule. All of these things are possible in this moment. And that is absolutely what Keats is interested in and excited by. I want to also give you a little nod to other important figures and how they're thinking and talking about the role of the poet, to give you some sense of who Keats might be seen to be, what kind of role he is taking on, or what kind of role he might imagine for himself. So here we have Shelley. Shelley talks about poets being the hierophants of an unapprehended inspiration. So a hierophant is, as we got the definition there, an ancient Greek priest who interpreted sacred mysteries, an expounder, a minister of revelation, the interpreter of the esoteric and the unknown. Poets are also the mirrors of the gigantic shadows which futurity casts upon the present, the words which express what they understand not, the trumpets which sing to battle and feel not what they inspire, the influence which has moved not, but moves. Poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. So to use modern parlance, then, we can maybe think of the poet as influencers and legislators of the world. They read and understand and shape and form the world. That is what Shelley is talking about here. And he talks about it again in perhaps clearer terms, where he says, poets, not otherwise than philosophers, painters, sculptors, and musicians, are in one sense the creators, and in another the creations of their age. From this subjection, the loftiest do not escape. So again, I want to give that sense that the role of the poet isn't just a passive external observer of things who documents quietly in a corner. These are people at the forefront of changing ideas, of capturing the moment, of being involved in protest, in revolution. That's the role of the poet. They are the campaigner, the resistor, the radical. They are not quietly sitting in corners writing beautiful verse. So we need then some sense of what is the Romantic poet doing, how they're contributing, what ideas are important to Romanticism. I should say that Romanticism is a problematic term. It's problematic in a number of ways. Firstly, the group that we associate with Romanticism don't call themselves that. They call themselves various things, but they don't really ever call themselves Romantic poets. That's a label that we've ascribed to them afterwards. And also what we'll see from the next few minutes is the ways in which this loose group of poets are subdivided, and those subgroups are quite often in conflict with one another. They disagree with each other. There's divisions in the ranks. So do be careful when you start talking about Romantic poets with a capital R. People know we will know what you're talking about when you use that term, but consider the fact that it has been applied retrospectively, and it kind of coalesces a bunch of people together in ways that they certainly didn't see themselves at the time. They in fact saw themselves as in opposition with each other and in conflict with each other. So we still have a need to have some sense of, well, if we are going to group them together, how might we know a Romantic poet when we see one? Like, what is important to a Romantic poet? So things are important to Romantic poets, and if we're going to use that term and apply it liberally and loosely to this bunch of people that we're going to encounter. At its heart, Romanticism is associated with radicalism, with anti-institutionalism, non-conformism in the religious sense, and disestablishmentarianism in the religious sense. So what do we mean here? We mean that they oppose institutions. A number of the radical poets that are associated with Romanticism are from a dissenting religious backgrounds, and that means that they're not allowed to go to Oxford or Cambridge. Romantic poets tend to be on the side of anti-establishment positions. They tend to align themselves with liberal politics against Tory politics. The Tory party that we know today, its origins go back into this time. So when you see the word Tory, we are talking in many ways about the same kind of party that we are today. I will say that for every label that we try to apply to the Romantic movement of writers, you'll find exceptions. Lord Byron, big Romantic poet, he absolutely, in many ways, belongs to the institution. He has the right to sit in the House of Lords. Yes, he is also very much opposed to the strictures that are placed on individuals, and he does perhaps puncture a lot of the ideas associated with establishment power. You know, the House of Lords, Church of England, religious movements, all of that has its grip on power, its grip on authority. Romantics, if you're going to align them in any way, elevates subjective individual experience and reject the ways in which institutions oppress and constrain individuals. So that's all linked up here. You've got to remember at this time, in order to hold power in Britain, you had to be a property owning white elite male. That is at its core what's where power is centered. So if you are the wrong class, the wrong gender, the wrong color, all of these things count in your disenfranchisement, your inability to access the seats of power. Now, as I say, people like Lord Byron are slightly complicated because they do have access. They are members of the elites, but they do reject those sources of power despite their privilege that they do hold. The other big things then are more about the things that we see in their writing, the things that they care about when they write. They are interested in imagination and creativity. They are interested in interiority and the inner self. So who we are as people, how we can come to terms with our own emotions, things like that. They're interested in the experiential. So in other words, the experiences one has and how those might shape us. They're interested in spontaneous thought, free from influence. They are often associated with melancholia, which is an 18th century term that we might modernize in slightly reductive ways as depression. Melancholia is not quite the same as depression, but they're certainly interested in the ways in which the mind is vulnerable to intense emotions which are generative and creative, yet also may be seen as difficult or problematic. And you can see that through their other sort of associated themes of being interested in suffering and loss, fragility of man in particular. They're interested in death and mortality and indeed immortality. And of course, their big thing is about being visionary. So when the world has gone through this turbulent period, you need visionaries who are going to take it in a new direction. They would understand totally the impetus of radical political campaigners such as AOC in America, for example, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who's proposing a radical politics. They would understand Bernie Sanders' position on things, and they would recognize that desire for change and the need for vision in order to achieve that kind of change, right? So who belongs then to this loose coalition of romantics? I'm going to introduce you to them in their various schools, because that will also point to some of the divisions that exist in this romantic history. The idea that they're in any way a homogenous single group is completely false. There's huge rivalries even within these groups. Wordsworth and Coleridge, for example, great friends, collaborators on things like the lyrical ballads, yet also rivals in many ways. So this idea that they're a conference of equals all coming together and being friends always is definitely not the case. Okay, so the Lake School, they are associated with the Lake District. They are perhaps what we picture most when we think of romantic with a capital R, because here you have your isolated wanderer walking through the countryside, having important thoughts about the nature of man, having emotional responses to the environment that they're walking around. and seeking a return to a simpler language of man. That's what they're trying to get us back to. I've given you some little samples as well of some of their most famous works, and I think a little nod to their visionary ideas. Also, you see with Southey some of his politics coming through there, where he imagines, he basically ventriloquizes, pretends to capture the voice of a figure of the poor. So you can start to see that move towards, in slightly problematic ways, but that move towards giving voice to people other than the elite, letting the poor speak not for themselves, because he is of course speaking through that persona, but still it's a moving of our attention to different kinds of speaker, and that's really important. However, this is not to say that these are lovely people. You'll notice there's a sort of lack of women here. Now, this is nothing to do with an absence of women, and everything to do with the way legacies are created. Now, I'm not going to sidetrack us into talking about all the many and important female romantic poets like Charlotte Smith, like Anna Letitia Barbauld, but I want to give you some sense of why are they not on the school syllabus, these great female poets who actually came before all of these men here, and actually were the ones who, if you're going to say were groundbreaking, who you're going to say were the ones who really began this thing called Romanticism, it would be your Charlotte Smiths and your Anna Letitia Barbaulds. This gives you some sense of why. So Barbauld really promoted Wordsworth and Coleridge and supported them when they were young men. She was much older than them. She had about 20-ish years on them. She was well established as a poet from a dissenting background. So she's from the radical area of Stoke Newington in London. She's not allowed to go to university because she's a woman and because she's the wrong religion. You have to be Church of England to be able to go to university, and also not to be a woman. But she really supported them. And then that the little gang of Southey, Wordsworth and Coleridge believed that she had written an unfavourable review anonymously of one of Coleridge's poems. And boy, did they turn on her. Although these are in the letters, these attacks upon Mrs. Barbauld, you can see the kind of aggressive hostileness, and you can see how it's quite similar to the social media barracking that people can experience today. I mean, look at the violence that they're imagining upon her. I mean, you would sort of almost imagine that these were the words of some kind of early 19th century incel, trying to tie crackers to her hair and her petticoats, literally trying to set her on fire. It's horrible to see. Doesn't detract from their amazingness as poets, their brilliance as poets, but I think it does point to the ways in which women romantic poets have been erased from the popular syllabus of, for example, the school syllabus and things like that. And I just wanted to give you some sense of where are the women. You might also ask, where are the writers of colour? And there were some, and again, they are generally only taught at universities. So the most famous example is Phillis Wheatley, who is one of the founders of modern African American literature. So they are there, but it's this kind of hostility by men who do manage to access privileged spaces and get to shape the narrative that has led, I think, to their exit from the typical school syllabus. All right. The Satanic School. So to give you a sense of the enmity between these different subgroupings of romantic poets, Southey, who was in the previous slide, clearly not a very nice guy, but he also labelled Shelley and Byron and Thomas More as belonging to the Satanic School. He doesn't quite name them directly, but he makes it very clear through his work that he is condemning these three poets who are interested in a different way of thinking about, for example, their relationship to religion and the voice that they give to certain figures in their work. Southey condemns readers, authors, and critics for their interest in these poets, because he regards their writing as monstrous combinations of horrors, mockery, lewdness, and impiety with which English poetry has been polluted. And because of their interest in the sexual and the sensuous, these three poets, he further condemns them as their works being intended as furniture for the brothel. So really getting a sense then of the enmity that exists between these different schools, and perhaps slightly their different focuses. So the Lake School, very much associated with man's relationship to nature, pantheistic in nature. The Satanic School, perhaps more sexually charged, more interested in relationships, in desire, things like that. That's not to say that they don't talk about nature. That's not to say that the Lake School don't talk about desire. But when people seek to kind of group them, they group them in these ways. I think perhaps a much more sort of effective way of looking at this is purely looking at circles of friendships rather than looking at their writing as a way of grouping them. I think it's more just these are people who work together in and are friends with each other. Okay, and then what you're all here for, which is the Cockney School, the London School, which largely coalesces around Leigh Hunt, who is less well known today. You see Shelley kind of makes an appearance here as well. Again, it points to the borders being a bit porous. Keats and Hunt are the ones who are really working together. Blake is a bit of an outsider. He doesn't really belong. He's not quite part of the friendship group, but he writes on similar things. He's from London. He writes about London. He's interested in the working class experience of London. And so in that sense, he belongs here, perhaps. So yeah, the Cockney School, they are radicals in terms of the political radicals. They are friends, Keats and Hunt, and they work together, and they are not received well at the time. And I'm going to give you some sense of that now. I want to give you a sense that Keats was a poet on the margins. He was a poet who was very much on the outside of this movement, there with Hunt, and they're rejected massively by the other two schools, who clearly are not fans of each other. But we'll look into that. And I want to give you that sense that a poet might be received at the time differently from how we see them now, and it's worth always reflecting on how does that attitude to their work change over time. All right, this is the last bit for us today. So Lockhart condemns Keats, rejects Keats' work here massively. Keats is a young poet whose background is as a medical man. So he actually goes to what is now King's College London, the university, and he trains in medicine. But he really abandons it, and he's far more interested in being a poet. And that gives you some sense of how and why Keats is rejected in this review of his work. Of all the manias of this mad age, the most incurable as well as the most common seems to be no other than the metromanic. The just celebrity of Robert Burns and Miss Bailey has had the melancholy effect of turning the heads of we know not how many farm servants and unmarried ladies. To witness the disease of any human understanding, however feeble, is distressing, but the spectacle of an able mind reduced to a state of insanity is of course 10 times more afflicting. It is with such sorrow, you can hear the double-edged nature of this. It is with such sorrow as this we have contemplated the case of Mr. John Keats. This young man appears to have received from nature talents of an excellent, perhaps even of a superior order, talents which, if devoted to the purposes of any useful profession, must have rendered him a respectable, if not an eminent citizen. For some time we were in hopes that he might get off with a fit or two, but late the symptoms are terrible. The frenzy of the poems was bad enough in its way, but it did not alarm us half so seriously as the calm, settled, imperturbable, drivelling idiocy of Endymion. John Keats has a sort of vague idea that the Greeks were a most tasteful people, and that no mythology can be so finely adapted to for the purposes of poetry as theirs. It is amusing to see what a hand the two Cockneys make of this mythology. The one confesses that he never read the Greek tragedians, the other knows Homer only from Chapman. It is a better and wiser thing to be a starved apothecary, medical, kind of like a pharmacist, than a starved poet. So back to the shop, Mr. John, back to the plasters, pills and ointment boxes. So here we get a lot of the anxieties of radicalism. What are the Cockney School doing? Well, the Cockney School were not those who had a privileged education in Greek and Latin. They're reading those works, if at all, in translation, such as the reference here, knowing Homer, as in the ancient Greek writer, through the translation by Chapman. So it really is a masterclass in classism here, right? So Keats is being rejected because he isn't educated in the classics, and because his work, along with the work of Robert Burns and Joanna Baillie, are being taken up and read by farm servants and unmarried ladies. So you get both a class and a gender issue emerging there. So you see the levels in which they're being rejected. So this sense then that Keats is not an elite figure in ways that we might understand today. Yes, his association with going for a medical degree, a profession, might seem kind of fancy to us in our modern day, from a modern day perspective, but actually back then it wasn't regarded quite so highly, and the sense of sort of the barbarism of the surgeon's table is implied there. Possibly should have had a bit of content warning, but here we have an example of amputation, and you can see the viewing gallery up here. So all medical treatments such as this were a public gathering. It's like a theatre. That's why, in fact, we call the operating theatre an operating theatre, because you would literally have an audience. You were a showman if you were a surgeon. So you can again pick up the kind of the classism, the snobbery of that review. So yes, Keats abandoned his medical degree though, to become a poet, and he suffers from tuberculosis and is dead very, very young. So you know, neither his medical nor his poetical career really had any kind of longevity, because he was a very young man when he died. So Lockhart again. Keats wrote indecently, probably in the indulgence of his social propensities. He outhunted Hunt in a species of emasculated pruriency that looks as if it were the product of some imaginative eunuch's muse within the melancholy inspiration of the harem. So again, Lockhart is very concerned by Keats's sensual writing. His there's this suggestion here that Keats is a bit of a sexual failure, but continually interested in sexual sensual things. Byron, I've edited it out because Byron uses much richer language than this. He imagines Keats as having a love affair with his own imagination, so that Keats is having a love affair with Keats's own imagination, written in very ribald, rude language, which I'm leaving out because I think YouTube will not let me use those words. But you get some sense of how strongly he's writing about Keats here in Byron's letter to John Murray, the publisher. Here are Johnny Keats' pea-a-bed poetry. No more Keats, I entreat. Flay him alive. If some of you don't, I must skin him myself. There is no bearing the drivelling idiotism of the mankin. And again, you can hear the snobbery and the rejection of Keats by calling him a mankin, which is kind of, you can hear the derogatory infantilization going on here. But I want to finish with a sense of why might we care about Keats. Next video, I will be talking about Keats as in the context of his poetry, who he is, give you a bit more biographical detail. But Keats is more than just a sensual poet writing about sensual things. I think Keats's own letters absolutely destroy the opinion of Quiller Couch, who in 1925 says Keats has no politics, no philosophy of statecraft, little social feeling. He is a young apostle of poetry for poetry's sake. I think we can really see that Keats here is not that. Keats talks of the French Revolution having an unlucky termination. It put a stop to the rapid progress of free sentiment, free feeling, i.e. freedom of speech, in England, and gave our court hopes of turning back to the despotism of the 16th century. They have made a handle of this event in every way to undermine our freedom. They spread a horrid superstition against all innovation and improvement. The present struggle in England of the people is to destroy this superstition. What has roused them to it is their distress. Perhaps on this account, to the present distresses of this nation are a fortunate thing, though so horrid in their experience. This is no contest between Whig and Tory, but between right and wrong. I'm going to finish on that note, but I think it points to why we might look at Keats now as a way of thinking about where we are today, dealing with pandemic, with the politics of recovery, with this sense of a world pulled apart by something out of our control, and that potential then, going back to what Saudi says, for regeneration. Those are the things that are important to Romantics, and those are the things that you can see here that Keats is working through. He's interested in politics, he's interested in freedom, he's interested in rescuing the poorest who are most in distress. And that's Keats. So join us next time when we look at Keats and his biography in far more detail. And I look forward to speaking to you then.